I am inviting you to step forward and to ask yourself, if not me, who? If not now, when?
I'm Samira Ahmed, and in this podcast series we've been exploring gender inequality for women and girls, why it exists and what we can do to bring about change.
Feminism has to be something that has got both men and women to take matters forward.
We've met people from all over the world looking at their experiences of gender inequality.
Their cases are filed or just dismissed. Some of them don't even get to file the cases and end up in jail, criminalized.
And people who've been at the heart of the fight for equality.
The 60s and the 70s were a time of a great this could be different. It doesn't have to be this way.
But in this final episode, we look to the future. We want to understand our own sphere of influence. What can we do to make governments accountable? What action drives change? And what do we need governments and leaders to do? This is We Change the Rules. In October 2012, the Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard gave a speech in the Australian Parliament after the opposition leader, Tony Abbott, accused her of sexism.
I say to the Leader of the Opposition, I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. And the government will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. Not now, not ever.
It was a speech that would take on a life of its own, being repeated around the world and talked about and viewed online even to this day. As the first female Prime Minister of Australia, Julia had a unique insight into causes for gender inequality in leadership and also what was needed to bring about change. During a visit to London, we were lucky enough to speak to Julia and find out about her time in office and her hopes for the future. So as you know, we're looking at the long-term issues around trying to get gender equality. So we're looking at the history, where we are now and what are the hurdles and all the future and so on. And with you, I guess I'm really interested in, what your evidence of how you can change things, but also the impact of enduring sexism. So I wanted to start by asking you, looking back at your experience in Australian politics, but if I may say, in Australia in general, how you look back on particularly the sort of the gender equality, the misogyny, as you've, risen through your career.
When I look back at my time in politics, there were a number of things that I was expecting as a woman leader and a number of things that took me entirely by surprise. I did expect when I first became Prime Minister that there would be a deep interest in me being the first woman to hold the job and that there would be some people who were really positive and some people who weren't quite sure. But I made the assumption, which proved to be untrue, that the maximum reaction both ways would be in the early days of my prime ministership, and then people would kind of adjust and life would go on in Australian politics as usual. And I do have to say life in Australian politics is pretty robust, but it would be business as usual. What I actually found, and I was unprepared for, was that the sexism and misogyny actually grew over time. So the longer I governed, the more there were political issues that were in contest, the more gendered insults, misogyny became a kind of go-to weapon in Australian political debate. So I wasn't prepared for that. And one of the reasons in the years since, I founded the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here in London and one in Australia, and I've written with friends and colleagues on women and leadership, is to try and help women who are going to go through it themselves to prepare, to not be blindsided.
Just remind us, when you talk about the misogyny actually getting worse, which you didn't expect during your time in office as Prime Minister, can you just remind us of how that manifested itself? Both in terms of your colleagues, but also in terms of the media debate and what was going on social media in the world at large.
The misogyny was sort of metastasising everywhere, really. I mean, the time that I was leading Australia was the time in which social media was starting to be a real force on politics. And, the vile nature of the material on social media, unfortunately, it's still the same today, but the vile nature of the social media was, a new phenomenon in Australian politics and generally around the world, because the platforms were still relatively new. It was definitely in the traditional media, in the newspaper coverage, TV coverage, talkback radio was a particularly difficult area. We had back then in Australia some central radio personalities, so-called shock jocks, the sort of people that you would see on a Fox News style station today, and they really pounded on the sexism and misogyny. But it was also in the parliamentary debate as well, you know, throwing us insults across the table, both when people were giving speeches and had the call, as well as by way of snide interjections. So it was very broadly based.
The 10 years since you left office, can I ask, do you look at Australia and you think that there has been positive progress made?
Yeah, I don't think a lot of this is about Australia, and I guess to some extent I would say that, wouldn't I, because I'm a very proud Australian, very proud of my country. You know, I think there are some things in the Australian political culture and the Australian media landscape and the nature of politics in those days. I led a minority government which helped turbocharge all of this. But in the years since, I've made it my business, particularly when I wrote a book on women and leadership with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is now the Director General of the World Trade Organisation and was the first woman to be a Foreign Minister and Finance Minister in Nigeria. I've made it my business to interview women from all sorts of countries around the world. And whilst the amplitude of it varies from country to country, actually, the experiences of women are very, very much the same. They all talk about much more focus on appearance, much more focus on family structures, and needing to walk this very tight, thin line between coming across as too strong, in which case people conclude you're not very likeable, or coming across as too kind and empathetic, in which case people might well conclude you're an incredibly nice woman, but they're also likely to conclude that you're too weak to lead.
Can I ask you how you reflect back on that famous speech you made about misogyny in Parliament? That was 2012, wasn't it? And it had a massive impact around the world. It's something particularly powerful about a woman's words being reported as news in their own right. What did you try to convey in that speech? And what do you think has been the long-term impact of it, given your ongoing campaigning for equality?
The misogyny speech was a speech given, you know, in the moment, in the flow of parliamentary debate. It wasn't a speech that I had prepared for. If you'd said to me, you know, in a month's time you're going to give a speech on misogyny, I couldn't have given that speech. That speech was very much in the parliamentary moment. And it, in many ways, never ceases to amaze me that all these years later we're still talking about it, and women come up to me to talk about it, and, you know, it's become a thing on TikTok and heavens knows all sorts of other social media platforms. And in many ways I'm proud of having given that speech and having given a sort of voice and framework and analysis of misogyny. I'm proud that it's clearly given women who have listened to it heart. I've, met many women who have literally said that they've watched it hundreds of times and they use it as a galvanising device when they're getting ready to go out into the world. So all of that heartens me. What is a bit disheartening is for the 10-year anniversary of the misogyny speech last year, we did publish a book called Not Now, Not Ever, and it was a joint endeavour, me and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and we were surveying really what has happened in the 10 years since, what's better and what's worse. And happily we came to the conclusion that some things are better, and there's certainly a much more active debate about misogyny and sexism in women's leadership. But some things are worse. You know, the toxic masculinity online influences are, you know, more of a phenomenon today than they were back then. So it's the very traditional, when we take strides forward in gender equality, the pathway is not a nice, you know, upwards gradient ever heading towards progress. It unfortunately can be a bit like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
I want to talk a bit about digital rights and online safety, because it's a big part of equality now's work. And it's a particular challenge. You've already talked about how online misogyny is a huge part of the challenge women in public life face. I know in the UK we've had a number of women MPs say they're leaving Parliament because they cannot deal with the amount of abuse and threats they're getting and the impact on their lives. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how we can ensure the rule of law, human rights are upheld in this new world we find ourselves, where technical, algorithmic-led sort of programming is making so many decisions about the way that we encounter the world and the way that our public lives are treated.
Yeah, when we look at how vile a sewer social media is for women, it's quite clear that profound action is needed. And we also know that if we don't act, this has got every potential to get worse and worse as we emerge further and further into the world of AI and deep fakes and all sorts of manipulation. I think it's got two major dimensions. One is certainly regulatory, and that does require governments to act, and it requires governments to collaborate internationally because obviously the flow of information around the world on social media is truly global. I do think even in a world where getting global consensus is so difficult, we should be striving for it, for more and more connected regulatory action. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me that I could not, contact a newspaper and buy a paid ad which called for someone to be killed or to be raped. No traditional media would accept that advertising, but I could tweet that in the next 10 seconds if I took it into my head to do so. So we've got to be doing more to crack down on the misogyny and various other forms of discrimination and stigmatisation in social media. I also think it requires education, education about these platforms, about misogyny and sexism, about our responsibility as citizens and how we engage in democratic discourse. And I think there's some things we need to think about in terms of how society embraces young men. These toxic influences could only be getting the kind of purchase that they are if young men are online looking for something, looking for male role models, looking for that kind of leadership. And I think we've got to get very analytical about what is the absence that they're trying to fill and to have ways of promoting far better, healthier, inclusive versions of masculinity.
There's two really interesting issues there. I'll take the first one first, which is if we are talking about how everyone needs to take more seriously the regulatory framework, one of the dilemmas we have is so much of the new sort of high-tech online digital world is still, it was created by and is run by men, and particularly a certain kind of male. We've seen it in the way that, a lot of AI, a lot of algorithms have been effectively discriminating against people of colour, discriminating against women because of the material that's fed into them. The norm is overwhelmingly male in many of these worlds. And I wonder how we break that when the leadership hasn't really changed, has it, that much? A lot of women were in those companies and they end up quitting.
Yes, that's true. The leadership of the major platforms of AI is still skewed very, very male. I am, of course, a big supporter of women's endeavours in science, technology, engineering and maths. More women going into these sectors, more women going into creating this digital world and what will be the AI future for us. We've got to be pushing for that. But even in this era where that's not true, there are women on those corporate boards. There are women who are legislators. Just because you don't work at the forefront of tech doesn't mean that you can't understand the need for regulatory impact. I mean, I would point in this regard to the Elders, the group that was originally set up by Nelson Mandela, which is now led by Mary Robinson, the former Irish president. I mean, the Elders, by definition, are leaders in our world who are a bit more chronologically up on the clock, a little bit older. And they issued a statement about AI and were very clear, we are not the tech-savvy ones who are building this digital future, but we know a lot about what global cooperation looks like when it's working well, and we've got to get on with global cooperation and regulation in this field. So I don't think we should let the lack of women in the CEO, senior leadership, executive streams of these organisations hold us back from action.
And of course, crucially, it's not women's responsibility to fix all the problems that are about toxic masculinity. You mentioned as well, the importance of recognising that there is this gap somewhere that young men are seeking to fill online. They're looking for something. And so my other question is really what individuals can do. Because it can feel the whole system is loaded against us, can't it, when we're trying to bring about equality and progress seems so slow?
It can. Look, I absolutely get, indeed, sometimes I feel myself that you're out in the world and you're yelling into the void, you're continuing your advocacy, but it's like a sound waves going out, but change isn't happening. I think when we do feel like that, we just need to take a little reflective step back. Number one, the arc is still towards progress. If I look, across my lifetime, things are very different and much improved for women in many, many parts of the world than they were when I was a schoolgirl or a university student all those years ago. So we have made progress. And the fact that we have made progress in the past should give us courage and strength to say we can make progress in the future. And then, I joke with friends that life can feel like the title of the Hollywood movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once, where we're getting pushed and pulled in all sorts of directions. And no one can make change across every aspect of the landscape. But there is always something in your world you can do, whether that's improving your workplace, improving a community organisation you intersect with, whether that's pushing back through your own social media presence when you see other women being beset by sexism and misogyny, whether that is building out the capabilities and the numbers of men and women who are allies and activists. So there's always something we can do. And as individuals, if we each get about those things, then it amounts to a huge wave of change.
You know what's interesting is I'm a woman born in the same decade as you in the 60s, and we saw the impact of second wave feminism and so much legislative change, which helped to change the culture. And there has been progress, as you say. But I'm still struck by however many times people make the arguments, the data about the economic case for better childcare provision or, not allowing all these women to disappear from the workplace by failing to recognise supportive policies. Every time there's another economic crisis, it feels like women's equality is always a luxury that has disappeared down the pecking order again. And I wonder what your thoughts are looking to the future when we're in a situation where there's a lot of anxiety about many issues. We know that women are often particularly impacted by things like climate change and the economic crisis and COVID. What are your hopes for the future and how we build a more equal one?
I think when it comes to looking at issues right across the board, we've got to use an approach really of embrace and embed. I don't think we can queue change in some nice orderly queue. Let's do climate change first, and then when we've done climate change, we'll do poverty reduction second, and when we've done poverty reduction, then we'll get on with racial equality, and then when we've resolved that, we'll get on with women's equality. I mean, that's not our world. People present to the world as whole human beings with a variety of characteristics, and how they navigate the world is in part a function of those characteristics. So we've got to, respond to people's whole selves. And then of any, issue that requires our attention, it is true to say that there is a gender impact and other forms of impacts on communities who can be stigmatised and discriminated against. And we won't solve that crisis overall without including everyone in the dialogue and discussion for change. I mean, we know that for sure on climate change, that women are a big part of the solution and women and children are a big part of the community most at risk as the climate changes. We know with poverty reduction that of the people alive in our world today who live with the impacts of the most extreme forms of poverty, they are disproportionately women and disproportionately children. And so we've got to embed our gender analysis, our feminism in tackling all of these issues rather than just try and sandwich shop style say take a number and watch turn.
With this Global Institute for Women in Leadership, which you've co-founded, it's so exciting. Can you give us a snapshot of some of the stuff that's on your agenda over the next year, you know, what we can look forward to you trying to do?
Yes, it is very exciting. I founded the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London just over 5 years ago, and we've been joined by our sister institution at the Australian National University in Canberra. And our mission is to deepen the evidence base on gender inequality, what is holding us back, and to develop the most effective change strategies. Because in an area as complicated as gender inequality, the last thing you want to do is to waste $1 or a minute on doing something that doesn't work for the greatest impact. So whilst we are focused on the research, we're very, very driven by getting the research into impact, so getting it into the hands of people who can make a difference. And so we're working on fronts from how do we change organisational and corporate culture to better include women, to are women fairly represented in the media, and if not, the change strategies for that. What changes need to happen in politics to make politics more of a home for women. What's the best mechanisms for role modelling and ensuring that deepens change. We work on projects to analyse and then make recommendations around improving government policies, government regulations, things on the gender pay gap and beyond. So it's a big waterfront of things that we work on, and we hope that women who are pursuing their activism and their own change agendas can pull on those threads to help deepen the work that they're doing and perhaps point the way for some new solutions.
I'm really wondering about some of the men you must meet in the course of your work at the Institute. Not the ones who are already on board as allies, but the ones who might be in leadership positions who are unconvinced. And I wonder if you're optimistic about the impact you're already seeing in the last couple of years with those kinds of people of influence.
I am optimistic, and there are a few things that feed into that. Number one, I think in the business community and in many other places, the argument has been had and is now largely accepted that diverse, well-managed teams make a difference to the quality of the decision-making and consequently the quality of the outcome. So even for leaders who don't feel a moral push, there is now a very clear business push. And so I think that is activating people towards change. But I wouldn't want to underestimate, too, the number of leaders who have actually signed on to the moral push. You know, I do meet lots of men in business who are very conscious that their work-life journeys have been different to their female colleagues, and they know that that is unfair and that it needs to be changed, and they're very motivated to do that for the next generation of women and the generation after that.
My other question is about generations. It sometimes feels right now that older women are being told, you have nothing to teach us, and that our views are obsolete and that everything is different. And I wonder, as someone who's held so many positions in politics, but is yourself now beginning your 7th decade, how you feel about the way older women's experience is used or ignored, and how important it is to achieving equality.
I think older women can get sidelined and do get sidelined, and there's unfortunately a lot of, popular discourse that is very offensive about older women. But my own experiences, and certainly my hope for the future, is that there's a happy blending of the insurgent, right on the minute new thinking that is coming from the new generation of activists, and that we need to learn from them around that. But then there is an exchange from those of us who have lived for a few more years and consequently have more context, more experiences, and we can share the benefits of that. I'm I'm a big believer that there's a powerful combination in new energy, new ideas, and some old wisdom and experience being put together.
That's so well put, Julia Gillard. What an honour to speak to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Samira.
It was a delight to speak to Julia and to hear of the work that she's doing to support women in leadership. So in this final episode, we're looking at the future for gender equality for women and girls around the world, and also the impact, what comes from activism and from speaking out to drive change. Thelma Fardin is an Argentinian actress, and in 2018 she famously filed charges against another actor for a historical sexual assault that happened when she was just 16. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through Argentina.
I never imagined the role I will have in the feminist movement in Argentina. My testimony and accusation sparked the Me Too movement in my country. Before my accusation, 3 other women had already shared stories of abusive situation involving the same actor. At that time, I was living in Mexico and decided to return to Buenos Aires to learn how to file a complaint. I traveled to Nicaragua, where the crime occurred when I was 16 years old and my abuser was 45. I chose to make my accusation public because I prefer to be the one telling the story. The impact of the press conference given by 200 Argentine actresses was so significant that calls to violence victim support helplines increased by 1,200% within 24 hours. It was a before and after moment.
It's so inspiring to hear the words from Thelma and to see that there are individuals who are shaping moments and driving change in countries for women and girls. For our final conversation in this podcast series, we're going to speak to Mona Sinha again, the Global Executive Director of Equality Now. What does gender equality in the law mean for all of us, and how is Equality Now helping bring that change about? Mona, I spoke to you at the start, and now here we are again talking about the future of the work that you do. Can you give me a snapshot of what you see as some of the specific legal potential solutions for gender equality that we should take hope in, that you're focused on right now?
We have a very concerted strategy, Samira, going forward, and we call it future-proofing equality, which is a short-term strategy that I inherited but gives me great promise as we develop a longer-term strategy for taking this forward. In 2022, for example, we continued to call out discriminatory laws and we set better precedent through strategic litigation. We've had some big wins, which I can talk about. We won a massive case in Bolivia where a young 15-year-old who had been raped by her cousin 20 years ago and had filed suits in Bolivia that had been thrown out 3 times. We took it to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and it was accepted last November, which was promising, but we didn't know what the outcome was going to be. We made recommendations to the court, and this is groundbreaking because this redefines the very premise of rape as consent-based. So that's been a big win. We've also had new countries sign on to the Maputo Protocol. South Sudan was the newest one. We are working hard to change laws in Liberia against FGM. We just had last week Nepal changed their laws on nationality rights for women. The Maldives changed their laws on marital rape. So we are making progress, but there are also lots of things that are working against us.
Absolutely. Well, one of the other things I really have noticed when you look around the world is how it feels like there's a popular uprising for gender equality. So you look at Iran, for example, and the protests there, which were very brutally suppressed, but you saw men as much as women out on the streets wanting to change things. The same going back a couple of years in Sudan, where you saw women standing up, with megaphones as much as men, protesting and wanting democracy. And it feels like it's not public opinion that's the problem, is it? It's those who hold power. And I just wonder what the challenge is for you then in thinking how to get laws through when you're dealing with regimes like this.
Well, you know what's a sobering statistic is in 2009, only 9% of the world were ruled by autocrats. And today that number is 37%. So you can see where the patriarchy is gaining ground and shifting radically. But changing social norms and upending harmful systems and holding governments accountable requires persistence. It requires persistence, it requires collective power, and it requires long-term investments. And for me personally, as I lead equality now into the next phase of its journey, I'm really committed to embracing this unique value system of every part of the wider gender equality ecosystem. It starts with women and girls at its heart, but it also includes men, it also includes boys, it also includes people from diverse communities, because every voice matters. One of the incredible reports I read by a Harvard professor talks about the autocracy and autocrats most fearing women's movements. And that's because women are able to galvanize other people to join them. As you mentioned, in various parts of the world, women have been able to bring men along, family members who probably disagreed with them along, to see their point of view. And this can be very threatening to autocrats. So for equality now, it's very important for us to center women and girls, but to bring along these voices to challenge these things that are unacceptable in our world.
Mona, tell me more about the Equality Now Impact Report and that looking forward section.
Well, we know that looking forward, we need to have more gender equal laws. We need to have systems change that allows women to demand that their rights be amplified, that they have them, they have access to them, they have access to justice when justice is denied them. We have made in 2022 22 submissions to UN treaty bodies, and 16 of these have been considered. 10 resulted in more than 50% of our recommendations being adopted, so this is really good progress. We have worked in collaboration with over 150 partners across 34 countries. We've launched multiple publications in 2022 and continue to do more in 2023. We've directly contributed to changing 12 discriminatory laws in 2022. And this is around the world. In Cuba, where nearly a third of girls are married before the age of 18, the government approved a very progressive new family law that's exciting. It eliminates the exceptions to the minimum age of marriage, which is a change that could potentially benefit almost 300,000 girls in the country who were formerly at risk of being married as children. That's huge. In a different part of the world, let's go to Benin. In Benin, it reformed its nationality law to allow both men and women to transmit their nationality unconditionally to their children. So if you were a woman that married a man that did not have the same nationality as you, your children could still have that nationality. And that's a law that's prevalent in many parts of the world. So this is great precedent. And in the United States, the House of Representatives have made progress in recognizing the ERA. We still have a way to go, but the Equal Rights Amendment is on a steady path to, fingers crossed, being put into the Constitution of the United States.
A steady path is such a great image because it implies a long-term course and it implies patience and it implies that it's going to take a while and diplomacy to get there. You look at parts of the world like Iran where you wonder how far backwards are they going when it feels there had been progress if you look back a decade. What's your assessment of a country like that?
So Iran has gone backwards, reinstating hijab laws and so forth. You saw the huge uprising that happened in response to the murder of Mahsa Amini for not properly wearing the hijab. So Equality Now actually led and coordinated a joint oral statement on that, on the case and reports of sexual violence that were committed against protesters of her death. And we took this to the Human Rights Council in support of a resolution and the need for really an independent UN fact-finding mission. So we continue to highlight the need for reform of Iran's discriminatory laws, and the UN Human Rights Committee reflected this in their list of issues for Iran. And this is where we could put pressure on governments through using systems that are already in place that allows a unilateral global pressure to be put on countries.
I want to look ahead as well with you, Mona, to the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. Those of us who can remember that UN conference about women nearly 30 years ago, had a lot of optimism at the time. And I wonder how we should assess where we are now and what achievements there are to celebrate and what needs still to be done in relation to that in particular.
Well, 2025 will be the 30th anniversary. As in years past, we expect the UN's Commission on the Status of Women, which meets every March, to monitor the progress and then guide the states on what more needs to be done. Right now, if we look at it, SDG 5, which focuses on gender equality, really has not achieved what it set out to achieve. The UN last year put out a statement saying it would take 286 years to get to gender parity. I mean, that's not even my lifetime. That's not even my grandchild's lifetime yet unborn. So it's a bit disheartening. So I think our job as civil society, and especially as a human rights organization, is to hold governments accountable. And in this Beijing review process, too many countries still discriminate against women and girls. We've talked about some countries that have the law that don't implement them, and we have to hold them accountable. So even though we have advocated so many laws and we've had so much success in the world, there are so many discriminatory laws still on marital status, economic status, personal status, violence laws, and their devastating impact can be found around the world. So we have to keep the pressure on. We have to continue to build coalitions. We have to bring together coalition members across the world in person from nations and regions to increase the efficacy of their campaigns, to learn through peer-to-peer learning and training. If we develop successful collaborations like this, we've seen the impact that garners results in our favor. So demonstrating to policymakers the successful application of progressive laws helps them see the benefits of what those can garner. Because the trouble is, right now, it feels there's so many issues competing, and that women's equality somehow seems less important, that it's a luxury to think about. I remember this after the 2008 economic crash, when everyone said, we've got to just focus on, saving the economy. And immediately we saw the impact, women being predominantly laid off in many industries, despite the fact that we know if women had been involved in more decision-making, the crash may not have happened in the way that it did. And I wonder how you deal with that dilemma when there's so much, especially right now, around the economic situation in the world and the very basics of human rights, that somehow women's rights seem to be a subset of all of that. And that's the challenge, right? I mean, the challenge is, how do you center women's rights and not make it a subset of anything? Because we know that when women are centered, when the impact of women who are at the grassroots experiencing these issues are brought to the forefront, then the solutions are most robust. So if you think about climate change, which we've been talking about, think about indigenous women that represent maybe 5 to 7% of the global population, yet they actually steward over 75% of biodiversity. So why aren't we engaging them and asking them for the solutions that could help us combat climate change and put out a solution to climate justice that would help us all over the world, frankly? So we have to have a human rights action plan. And I also think we have to define women's rights and human rights as central to the development of our economies. Because let's face it, the world looks at the world as an economic bubble. Like you talked about the crash in 2008, where women were, unfairly laid off and so forth. If we had centered the role of women in economic agency and growing the prosperity of the country, then people who were making those decisions might have thought about it twice, right? And so centering that in terms of the goals of a country and having an action plan that's part of the economic plan that centers women and girls is really critical. You mentioned the importance of forging partnerships. Can you give examples of the kind of partnerships you're talking about and perhaps any that have worked? We have many, many partnerships that have worked. I think our secret sauce in being successful in changing laws rests with us being able to convene and collaborate in coalitions. So, for example, in Africa, in making sure the Maputo Protocol, which is the protocol for women's human rights, we are the sort of consolidator, if you will. We call ourselves a secretariat, but it's a very loosely formed coalition. And we bring together the Solidarity of African Women Human Rights, which is a collaborative enterprise, to really pressure those governments. There are only 11 of them that have not adopted the Maputo Protocol. And this has been hugely successful. We spoke about the multi-sectoral approach where legal rights can be applied to education and health and safety and economic agency of women. And this coalition allows for women's leadership to rise in its most beautiful form, take it back to their own countries and talk about the impact of centering women in policy. So that's one example. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Maputo Protocol this year. In Kenya, for example, the change in country and county governments has enabled us to forge new allies and deepen our existing relationships with government, and with a view to scaling up action towards prevention, towards response, so that we can provide them with training materials for police, for judges. We can hold moot courts at law colleges and universities of future lawyers and legal scholars. And by doing these coalition activities, we're able to engage many more forms of civil society than we would by acting alone. Another example, in a small country in the Maldives, we worked alongside our local partners and made significant progress in engaging with government stakeholders. And this enabled us to address sexual violence. It enabled us to reframe what marriage equality meant. And that ended up in having a law that prevented marital rape, which is huge. And it allows women to now hold perpetrators to account, which they didn't have that luxury before.
I love that example you gave is everything about how individual women and their experiences are changed by a law, which works on an individual basis rather than an abstract law, which in theory allows for something but has no impact. How would you sum up the role of equality now, looking ahead, and the focus of what you're working on to bring about change?
I see equality now as a big galvanizer. We are able to bring together these coalitions. We are able to convene them. We're able to create spaces where we can be abundant in sharing our experiences and the impact of having gender equal laws in the world. And by doing this, we're really able to showcase to the world we maybe haven't even lived our best lives yet, that having equality could unleash potential that the world hasn't seen and could have new frameworks of solutions and problem solving that could be inclusive and could be generative and abundant. And that brings me great joys.
You've just used an analogy which makes you both happy and incredibly sad, which is the idea that we haven't lived our best lives yet. And that's both frustrating, isn't it, as women, to think so many haven't, and yet also that potential that lies ahead. You are optimistic, aren't you, about the future?
I am very optimistic. I think the impact that we have had to date has been incredible. We have much to look forward to. We have a absolutely committed and dedicated team of our own that works on these issues day and night across the world in every corner. We are tackling some of the world's most intractable problems in family and religion that nobody else wants to even talk about. So we're shining light on issues that are holding back half the population of the world. I mean, how can that be a bad thing? We're drawing global attention to these issues. We're bringing governments on board to see our point of view. We're centering the lives and worlds and voices of women and girls. And by bringing their lived experience forward, we're showing that legal equality is absolutely the baseline for equality. And once you have legal equality, then people can live into their full lived equality, as I call it. And that could really be joyful. So I'm not held back by the inequalities that we see in the world. I'm just hopeful that organizations like ours, working with people around the world, can amplify and elevate the position of women and girls, and the world can see what we can bring to it.
Mona Sinha, thank you so much, and good luck with the challenge ahead.
Hello, my name is Tamer Dekanosidze. I'm from Georgia, and I'm Equality Now's Eurasia Regional Representative. Despite the numerous challenges faced in the region, there are several factors that give me hope for the advancement of women's rights. One significant source of hope is the emerging movements of women's rights, which many times mirror the global momentum toward gender equality. Over the past decade, alongside the pushbacks, we have witnessed remarkable progress in various parts of the world, and Eurasia has been no exception. Another reason for hope is the increasing willingness willingness of certain governments in the region to uphold their international human rights obligations, including those related to gender equality. Moreover, for me, the growing knowledge and expertise of legal professionals in the region is a source of great optimism. Historically, this has been an area lacking adequate attention, but now we are witnessing a positive shift. These factors collectively fuel my hope for positive change in the region. By leveraging the growing movement of women's rights, government commitments, and the expertise of legal professionals, we can continue to push for lasting advancements in gender equality.
I'm Samira Ahmed, and you've been listening to We Change the Rules, a podcast by Equality Now. I hope that we've managed to shine a light on the issues for women and girls affected by gender inequality, the journey that's led to where we are today, and the brilliant activists, leaders, academics and movements that give us all hope for change. We've covered an awful lot, and I've encouraged you to listen to the series again to hear all the stories we've covered. If you'd like to find out more about anything that you've heard, do visit equalitynow.org, where we continue the conversation and fight to bring about a just world for women and girls. Thanks for listening.